Today's topic is on the contemporary issue of breakaway leagues in sport. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. We have Dr. Katarina Pijetlovic, Assistant Professor at the Manchester Metropolitan University and author of the book EU Sports Law and Breakaway Leagues in Football. We also have Mr. Roshan Gopalakrishna, Partner at LawNK, and our moderator for the session, Mr. Jaideep Vaidya, Sports Journalist and Desk Editor at the Ken. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat box on Zoom. Now over to Mr. Jaideep Vaidya.
Thanks, Yogita. Good evening, everyone, or appropriate greetings of the day if you're joining us from elsewhere around the world. Thank you, first of all, for joining us today. I'm sure many of you are excited about Euro 2020, which begins later today. But we're here today to discuss a topic that could have grossly affected the squads of some of the teams that are participating in the tournament, had certain things in the past gone in another direction. The European Super League, or ESL, is arguably the biggest story in football this year so far. As you may all know by now, 12 of the world's richest football clubs decided one fine Sunday evening in April that they would break away to form their own little league with all the best teams from Europe, a challenger to the Uefa Champions League, which is like the pinnacle of European club football. But as it turned out, it was a rebellion that lasted all of 48 hours, starting with Chelsea, followed by the other 5 English clubs that had signed up. And then all but 3 of the 12 rebels quit the Super League after facing a hailstorm of protests from fans, administrators, league officials, politicians, everyone. But mainly it was the fans who made the difference, as they made their feelings about this breakaway league very clear to the owners of their clubs. Today, except Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Juventus, all 9 other clubs have apologized for their participation in this breakaway attempt. The 6 English clubs, which are Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, and Tottenham Hotspur, have even been made to pay a combined fine of 22 million pounds. Now we'll come to how ridiculous an amount of money that is a bit later. Katarina, you've written a book on EU sports law and breakaway leagues in football. You've studied this topic in depth. Could you start off by telling us the primary motivations behind something like a European Super League? Is it just the money, the 3.5 billion euros or whatever that all the clubs were guaranteed?
Well, you're quite right. The motive is primarily commercial and it has to do with money. It might have been also prompted or triggered this dream of creating Super League that existed since 98 in Europe, really. It might have been now given a push by the pandemics and by the fact that clubs are in major debts. The outcome of that, you've seen what happened, but now that everything is kind of done and dusted for now, we also got another information and we are a bit wiser as to why that happened. So as I mentioned, it was commercial motives because clubs believe that the pyramid structure in Europe, where they have to perhaps share a part of revenue in solidarity with other clubs, and they have to also engage in vertical solidarity, support the hat-trick programs and so on. They believe they can do better on their own. And in addition to that, the crisis created by pandemics, and now we know that also there was Infantino who was behind, the FIFA's president, in other words, who was behind the idea, and he was the perhaps one of the architects. But so apart from Agnelli, who is from Juventus and who is also, or he was, heading European Club Association, which is like a union for the clubs. It seems like the 2 of them, it has transpired now, have flown twice to United States even. So the entire breakaway league in Europe, it seems to fit into Infantino's dream of having a World Cup of clubs. And it seems like they had other 8 clubs from all over the world, one from China, one from Brazil, one from Argentina, and so on, planned as a part of this project, which, we didn't really know in April when it was all happening. So yes, it is something like that. And the unwillingness to engage in those solidarity mechanisms, the belief that they can do better, these dreams that are quite, in some way, quite selfish, and in some way, you could see a part of the, nobody in Europe, I think, supported it in any way, but you could see fans from other parts of the world that don't have that attachment to European pyramid, that don't know about the European traditions, which are really structured around that pyramid. They don't really care about the traditions in Europe. They just want to see more, games between the big clubs. And that's not perhaps what European fans want. So there was that.
We'll come to the European model of sports leagues a bit later, but I wanted to touch upon that point you made about FIFA's role. So, I mean, UEFA's opposition to the ESL is clear. It's a competitor to their cash cow, which is the Champions League. But like, as you said, like, I think it was the New York Times who reported that FIFA president Gianni Infantino and some other higher ups in FIFA knew about this ESL plan as far back as 2019. And the report said that, FIFA's backing of the the ESL was a key ingredient in the founding contract of the league. And in return, the ESL would, participate in the annual FIFA Club World Cup, which FIFA wants to host. But FIFA finally backed out. Why did that happen? And could such a league have gone ahead without FIFA's backing?
Technically, yes. I mean, European Super League could have happened without any involvement of FIFA. But as I said, it did fit into the broader World Cup idea. And that is why FIFA actually was backing the proposal, which of course interfered massively into UEFA's authority, into UEFA's power, because if FIFA were to take over control of the competition like that and take those clubs away from UEFA's regulatory power, that would be a blow, both commercial and otherwise. You're quite right. New York Times did report about this, but later on we also got confirmation from Javier Tebas, the La Liga president, and he's now in also, I think, European leagues that are representing the leagues in Europe, the organization. And he has just recently, on one conference, I don't know if you have listened to it, it's called Club Advisory Forum, organized by European leagues. And he has, in fact, stated himself, so it didn't come from journalists, it actually came from somebody like that Infantino was involved, and that he was in the documents of the ESL referred to as, I don't know, Mr. X, not exactly this.
World number one. World number one.
Thank you. Yeah, so that, he has identified him. So we do have confirmation that this is happening. And these stories about him flying together with Agnelli to United States twice, to meet with the, people there and discuss this proposal. This is also something that came out quite recently, also from the people that are involved in world of football. So there is more to this story than we knew in April. And now we are kind of a bit wiser.
And what made the clubs that signed up to the ESL so confident that something like this could go through? Are there no laws that prohibit such breakaway attempts? And if there are, then why did they still go ahead with the plan?
There is no law that says particularly that in general, alternative leagues are prohibited. In fact, they are not prohibited at all. But this particular breakaway league, in this way that was planned and in this format, would probably offend against European competition law, because it would be a closed league, which means basically preventing the market access for other participants of that market, for other clubs. And in European competition law, that is a restriction. Why did they do this, and why did they believe that it will work is beyond me. It was quite strange at the time it happened. It was also very strange that JP Morgan decided to invest into this project, because investors are very careful normally. Normally they explore the risks and they make detailed analysis, financial, legal, all the entire. And this time there was something like that the investor got involved on and we were wondering, colleagues and I, who is advising these clubs? So apparently, the idea must have come from, from that American system, because in America, closed leagues are legal under Sherman Act, which is equivalent of competition law provisions in Europe. And that is maybe, that was massively miscalculated. When the clubs, and this is for them, for the clubs involved in Super League, this is a sad part. The sad part is that they could have had it if they just approached it a bit differently. So what they should have done to make their league legal is approach UEFA and ask them for permission or for license or for approval. There is an Article 49 of the UEFA statutes which provides that such license or such approval, prior approval from UEFA, is actually needed. So if they did approach UEFA would then be under pressure to comply with law itself, and they would throw the ball on UEFA's side of the court. UEFA's legally now, as the basically regulatory monopoly that is holding the gates to the organizational market in football, but they are also participant in that organizational market and being the only, also monopoly commercially, being the only company on that market that is staging competitions, Champions League, Europa League, right? So they are really under, as a gatekeeper, who also has a power to issue licenses to other competitors on that market. They are under legal obligation to have non-discriminatory, transparent, and objective set of criteria. And of course, they have to be proportionate. So UEFA would now, if the clubs just approached it and asked it for license, they would have to come up with those conditions that comply with legal criteria, so that don't discriminate in any way between this applicant for that license and its own competitions on that market. So they cannot ask, for instance, a 20% of solidarity contribution when Champions League has only 8%. And they have to treat that competition in exactly the same way. They have to tell them a list number of conditions, and then the Super League would get this number of conditions that would have to be legal, because if they are not, they could just sue UEFA and win. And they could just say, okay, we are just going to comply with this set of legal conditions, and we are going to have our league. However, that would also mean for the clubs that they would have to have a system of promotion and relegation properly installed, and so on and so forth. So they didn't really think. So this was something quite extraordinary. And my feeling is that there is still more going on here that we don't know, and that clubs are still with that case that is now pending in European Court of Justice. They're actually testing things, and that is my feeling at the moment, that they're simply testing the landscape, the legal landscape, and they are perhaps playing some of those games with UEFA.
And this whole thing seems to be a conflict between two different models of sports leagues, like what you have in Europe, which is an open model with relegation and promotion, whereas versus what you have in the US, which is a closed league and franchise-based league rather than a club. Where like in the US, you don't, for example, play for your national team, whereas in Europe, by playing for these leagues, you get picked for your national team. I mean, did these clubs not understand that, the two can't gel, or was there a way for them to have gelled the two models, do you feel?
Well, it's a really good question, and the one that you can answer with a reference to what UEFA is actually organizing, the Champions League. If you look at it, theoretically, Champions League is sort of open, kind of, but if you look at the access criteria and coefficient criteria that looks at the historical records of clubs, if you look at it, that 5 clubs from some countries can simply immediately qualify for Champions League, whereas others can only have 1 club, and they have to go through qualification and so on and so forth. And then if you look at the 2024 format of Champions League that UEFA now planned, and that just on the eve of the announcement of the Super League, that UEFA was being reassured by both Agnelli and other people involved that in the European Club Association, that yes, we will approve this competition format and we will approve the Champions League 2024 format. We are quite happy with it. So just that the next day they would go and announce Super League. If you look at that 2024 format, it really is in practice a bit more of a closed league than normally UEFA would want you to think. Is quite closed. It is reserved for elite clubs, because small clubs cannot really break through ever out of qualifications even, and so on. So if you look at that format and explore it a bit and see the access criteria and all that, it's just kind of closed the league even more than it's been so far. And that is why we are seeing all the time the same clubs going into the last 8 all the time. It's every year the same scenario, and all the clubs that are winning the leagues, it's becoming rather, predictable. So you have to look at the things in the context of your question. You have to look at things from the practical point of view, and perhaps think whether this is starting to look more like the closed American leagues than the ones that European football actually claims to have, which is one that is based on promotion and relegation.
Right. Roshan, you follow European football. I'm going to start with maybe a bit of a personal question. Why were the fans so against it? Technically, they could have gone to see great contests like Manchester United versus Barcelona more frequently,
more often,
in the Champions League. So what was the main opposition?
So I think from a fan's perspective, the fact is that as the commercial model for sport has evolved, what it's ended up doing is alienating fans. So you have ticket prices going up, for instance. So the ticketing is something which is one of the 3 major revenue sources for any sports event or sports team. So there's ticketing, there's broadcasting, there's sponsorships. And you look at each of these, and they are obviously dependent on how much the fans are willing to spend. But for the fans who, I think, from the cities themselves, I think Katarina is in a city which has the 2 Manchester clubs. But the fact is that a lot of these clubs have blue collar origins. So the way that you and I may relate to Manchester United may not be the same for someone who's supported the club for generations, right, through the family. Someone probably had a great grandfather who worked for Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways, who then played a few matches for Newton Heath. They became Man United. So that link to the club probably goes back 130 years, right? But what's happening is ticket prices have gone up. It's only been the smaller clubs actually who kind of said, what, we're getting so much revenue from the Premier League, purely even from broadcasting, that we're now going to say, we're now going to cap ticket prices, right? And even for broadcasting, so while the European Commission said that the Premier League, for instance, couldn't foreclose the market for broadcast by granting rights for 10 years, and that they had to be granted every 3 years and with different rights holders. So it's great in principle, and I think we've seen a similar effect in India as well, with the Telecom Regulatory Authority saying the prices for television channels have to be capped. But in practice, what it's meant is that the cost of actually subscribing to TV channels has gone up. So if you're a fan in the UK now, the fact is there's blackout of games, and you can't watch. We're lucky to be watching, I think, the Premier League just on Star and Hotstar in India. But for a fan in the UK, there's everything right from a TV license fee to the fact that you need to subscribe to Sky, BT Sport, I think Amazon Prime, and which essentially means that you're going to pay ridiculous amounts just to watch one league. And finally, the fact that sponsorships obviously are meant to generate a lot of revenues for the teams. But the moment Adidas say, that we've signed a record deal with Man United, the price of jerseys automatically goes up. And for what honestly some pretty hideous designs, right? But fans are still buying them, saying, this is the club I love, this is the club I support. So I'm going to buy the £75 jersey. And if they change the design every year, I'm going to try and ensure that, I'll try and save up. I'm going to buy this. So I think that as opposed to the armchair fans, which I'm sure I can call you and me that, the actual fan in the ground, the fans who are filling up the stadiums, I think their link to the clubs is far stronger. Old Trafford, for all of the revenue that the world's biggest brand, which is supposedly Man United, generates, is supposed to be in complete shambles. right? In terms of basic facilities, in terms of the roof leaking and things like that. And as it turns out, even security measures now, with fans breaking through and coming onto the pitch. So I think this is a phenomenon we're going to see across the world of fans increasingly feeling alienated from the sports that they love and from the teams that they adore.
Right. And this closed model that's in the US, it's kind of similar to what we have in India, right? With the IPL or the ISL, but it's at the same hand, the players who participate in the Indian Premier League or Indian Super League also represent their countries. So, and we do have like a pyramid, so to say, at least in cricket and football to some extent. So, I mean, what do we have in India? Is it like a mix of both the European and American models?
So in football, what we currently have are two leagues, the I-League and the ISL. The Indian Super League is more of a closed model, which is franchise-based. And even the clubs that have come in, so with the exception of, I think, Bengaluru FC, who came in through the I-League, but who essentially were set up as a corporate team and not as a legacy team in Indian football. Right. So the structure that Indian sport has set in stone pretty much is that of the American franchise system. And it goes back to the fact that what you need are teams which are stable and team owners are willing to take that risk, because these are not insubstantial costs. Right. So the fact that you're setting up a team and you get the right to operate a team for, say, 10 years to begin with, it also means that you don't know if the league is going to work or not. You don't know if there's a dedicated or rather, a stable source of revenue for your team. And if you look at even franchise agreements and things like that, the only commitment made is to have the first season of the league. That's it. With the rest, if the league doesn't work, the league just winds up. So while that stops you from making your payments for the second year onwards, assume the league doesn't happen in the second year, the fact that you've still sunk that investment for the first year. And it goes substantially towards, branding your team, towards acquiring players, the cost involved during the season as well. So while it's a pretty short season of 2 months, for instance, for the Indian Premier League, there's still substantial cost involved in getting your players to fly in, and even in coordinating to ensure that they have NOCs, for instance, to ensure that they can participate. And what it's done for the other teams, the legacy teams, like the teams that take part in the I-League, for instance, is that the franchise structure is good because the legacy teams actually have more of a grassroots program going. So if you look at clubs like, say, Gokulam, for instance, they are the ones who are nurturing clubs, they're nurturing players at the grassroots. So the fact that there's money coming in, the fact that there's the City Group, which is invested in Indian football, only means that their players, they're finally going to get transfer fees for their players. So it results in a more stable contractual structure for the players. It means better wages for the players. And while it raises the profile of the game, I think that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with the quality of the sport, at least in Indian football. But it's definitely a start. And I think we need this franchise structure to ensure that there's the top of the pyramid is stable, so that the sources of revenue go down to the grassroots. And we've seen it with the IPL. I think with the increase in the broadcast fees, it's also meant that the BCCI is able to pay pensions to former players, to bring in insurance schemes. So the positive effects, I think, of the franchise structure cannot be ignored. But yes, I think having a closed league also comes with its own risks and perceptions. And obviously, in a closed league, a sports team is set up to be a business first, as opposed to, I think, having an open system where, teams are set up to be either set up for recreation or just to promote the sport, where the larger motive is promotion of the sport or development of a local community and not pure business. And which is another thing that I think is alienating fans from the clubs that they like. It's the change in ownership, for instance. It's the fact that you have Russian oligarchs and the petrodollars coming in from all across the world. You have American hedge funds coming in and saying, yeah, this may be whatever it was for so long. Now it's a business, and we're going to run it as a business. And Katarina mentioned the fact that JP Morgan were coming in to finance the entire ESL, but the fact is that essentially, while these clubs had debts of 2.3 billion pounds among them, 12 clubs. So apparently what JP Morgan have offered them, it is an advance of $3 billion, 3 billion pounds, sorry, 3 billion pounds. But it's an advance to be set off against any revenues that the league would have generated. So you're just replacing existing debt with another kind of debt.
It's funny coming back to what we have in India, because the spurt of professional leagues that we've seen over the last decade after the IPL came up because of a rebel league, the Indian Cricket League, or ICL, which was formed in 2007 without the blessings of the Indian cricket governing body, BCCI. And I mean, it was a popular tournament, wasn't it, Roshan? Like, until the BCCI forcefully pulled the plug 2 years later.
It was fairly popular. I definitely remember watching it while I was in college. But the fact also is that, as with the World Series of Cricket, right, the Indian Cricket League didn't emerge from a genuine need to promote the game or to increase opportunities. It emerged from the fact that the BCCI just terminated Zee's broadcast rights contract. Well, and while there was a legal battle that followed later, the fact is Zee went out and said, okay, if we need to we are going to create content on our own. And the way to do that is to set up a separate league, which we are going to broadcast on our channels. And we're going to increase subscription revenue. So I think while we could say that, the ICL was the forerunner of professional leagues in India, the fact is that it didn't emerge from a pure motive of just supporting the sport. There was an ulterior motive. It's something we've seen with World Series of Cricket as well. Like Kerry Packer started World Series of Cricket purely because what was then the Australian Cricket Board said, we know you're offering a lot of money for broadcast rights. This was in the mid-70s. But they said, we've had an association with another broadcaster for so long that irrespective of whatever you offer, we're not going to go with you. Almost, I think any rebel or breakaway league ends up having 3 ingredients, so to speak. The first is just a grievance against the way things are run. The second is, a private promoter who comes in and says, I will back this. For the ESL, that was JP Morgan. And the third is there's a large enough pool of players as well who are ultimately probably the greatest stakeholders on field, who are saying, hey, you know what? If I need to play for my state or I need to play for my country, there are only that many slots. And maybe I'm not good enough to make it there. Or maybe there are other reasons that prevent me from getting there. But why should that stop me from earning a good livelihood? And if I know I'm not going to play representative sport, I might as well go join a league that's paying me $100,000 for 2 months of work.
Yeah. And I mean, the ICL did not manage that. But World Series cricket, Kerry Packer's World Series kind of did, right? Because it was much bigger than the ICL at its time. And it had big stars like Ian Chappell and Tony Gray.
Imran Khan.
And it kind of revolutionized cricket at the time by, introducing day-night matches and colored clothing. So, I mean, you could argue that it did good for the sport.
It did good for the sport, but there are also stories that came out, right? That when once the season started, and Kerry Packer then went to the UK to meet with the ICC, because they had at that point imposed certain conditions on the eligibility of players who were associated with the World Series of Cricket. And one of the stories that I have read is that so he created a positive image of himself through television interviews and radio interviews, where he came across as someone, who was just trying to promote the sport. But when he reached the negotiating table with the ICC and with the TCCB in England at that point, he said, you know what, I'll step back. We'll figure out what to do. We'll come back to the pyramid of sport in some sense, the way it's run through the ICC. But you need to ensure that I get the exclusive broadcast rights for all Australian cricket. And similar to the ICL, the World Series cricket wound up in 2 years. Obviously, it had other issues as well, in terms of players being banned from, or at least the ICC and the TCCB tried to ban players from participating in their competitions. They also did not have access to proper cricket facilities in Australia. And apparently the Marylebone Cricket Club also said that you can't call these matches test matches because that's conventional naming rights in cricket, which is why Kerry Packer then came up and said, okay, we're going to call them super tests.
Katarina, coming back to you, I read, that this breakaway plan in European football has cropped up once or twice a decade, like for the last 30, 40 years or so. One of the most significant attempts, I think, in the last 20, 25 years was the 1998 Media Partners Proposal. The plan was to have two competitions, the Super League and the Pro Cup, kind of similar to what today's Champions League and Europa League is. And I think this was the first time that this Super League was discussed, if I'm not wrong. So what happened then? Why could it not go ahead?
Well, back then, it was, by the way, Media Partners International was owned by Silvio Berlusconi, and he's and he's also been involved with Milan football club, and so it kind of came up in '98, and the plan back then, if you compare it to the Super League in April, it was very, very detailed. There were hundreds and hundreds of pages of financial marketing information and planning and risk assessments and competition formats. So all the details were included. So it was a serious plan back then. And this plan was then notified to European Commission for approval. Because before 2004, companies on the market, well, football clubs are companies, they could send to European Commission agreements that they didn't really know if they comply with competition law or not, and then Commission would give them the opinion on it, prohibit the agreement or approve it, or give them just some comfort letter saying, yeah, go ahead, but be careful, or something like that. So companies would, and once you notify the agreement, you are kind of immune from fines or from any punishment, because you have voluntarily, submitted that agreement for examination to the competition authority. And that way, that was before 2000. And when this was in front of European Commission, at the same time, UEFA was, of course, faced with something quite different and quite difficult, and they have decided then to invite the clubs by the negotiating table and come up with a format of European Champions League that would suit the clubs and that would accommodate the needs of the biggest club, which is when more spaces were given to clubs from England, from Spain, from Italy, more permanent spots, so to speak, in a Champions League. And that was then a matter of a compromise, and this then was withdrawn from the European Commission. So before the European Commission had a chance to say whether this was legal or not, and whether under the European competition law it could work, they in fact withdrew the entire notification of that agreement. So we don't know what would happen and what would Commission say, but we do know that after this, UEFA was basically forced into compromise of some sort, and clubs back then in '98 got this idea, oh, well, this worked well, so we can use the threat of breakaway leagues every time when we want something. More say in the governance, more money, rules to be created the way that suit us. And yes, you're quite right. In the past, perhaps 25 years, you could then, after '98, you could hear a lot every couple of years, perhaps every 3 years at least, you will hear, oh, there's going to be a breakaway league. This Super League is going to be created, and it kind of coincided also with the broadcasting rights that are going in 3 years cycle. So there is that feeling that while in the beginning UEFA was quite opposed and to these leagues and to these clubs, and they were kind of standing up to them, over the time they just learned to accommodate everything that clubs want that way, and they've entered also into a certain agreement with the clubs. And that agreement simply provides that UEFA will recognize the European Club Association, where these elite clubs are basically deciding on everything on behalf of everyone. Not really. There are no medium and small size clubs properly represented, and their voice isn't properly heard in the governance. So the ECA, then the European Club Association, recognizes UEFA according to that agreement as the only organization that recognizes a monopoly, that has monopoly to organize competition, and in turn UEFA recognizes the ECA as the sole representative of the clubs. And that agreement is kind of also, in my opinion, perhaps stepping over the lines of the competition law, because first of all, it doesn't allow for proper representation of small and medium-sized clubs, which means they cannot have voice in the governance, which means that they cannot affect the rules that are always then created to suit the elite clubs, and so on.
And Jaideep, if I may just add that, I think even the plans for the ESL, right? So in addition to the 12 original clubs saying judge us by our brands and not by our on-field performance, they also went out of their way to look at other teams who could join the ESL as well. So it was 12 plus 3. The 3 teams that apparently didn't join were the 2 German teams, Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund, and PSG from France. So while they wanted a full roster of 15 teams, there was also supposed to be an additional 5 teams which would join the competition every year, but who would end up being, the more prominent but smaller clubs. It wasn't very clear how they were going to do this. So clearly the message also wasn't lost on the larger clubs. They realized that they needed the smaller clubs to work with them, but on the terms that the larger clubs would prescribe. So for the Premier League clubs, for instance, very clearly also wanted to play in the Premier League. So just that, they would treat the Premier League the way they would the FA Cup or the EFL trophy, saying we're going to put a bench to play, these weekend matches and all the other tournaments. But the fact is we need revenue from here and from there, because we have such large businesses with such large debts that we need to service those debts, and that's what comes first to us. But otherwise, that we need, as many matches as we can offer to all our players and to all our sponsors, more importantly. And we can then go to a sponsor saying, you know what, Premier League, 38 matches, stick. And every year we're going to play at least 20 matches in Europe. Because how the manner in which a traditional sponsorship or an apparel deal works is that while there are bonuses for how well teams do on the field, there are also reductions in the fees. And I think some of the clubs didn't like the fact that the smaller clubs, like a Leicester City, for instance, or an Atalanta in Italy more recently, that they had risen purely because the distribution of money through the larger business model of the sport for these leagues was more equitable. So, instead of the traditional La Liga giants getting 150 million euros from broadcasting, from negotiating their own broadcast deals every year, 2016 law kind of said, you know what, scrap that. Everyone gets a share in the collective pool and no one negotiates deals on their own. So you're saying, that you need the other clubs with you, but there's a very small role for them and they better listen to you in terms of looking up to you and saying, oh my God, where would we be without Real Madrid and Barcelona? As opposed to probably, not realizing that no one wants to watch Real play Barca every day.
Right. Yeah, there was this dance. There was this dance between UEFA and these elite clubs all the time since '98 that you could see the threat happening, which wasn't even maybe viable. Maybe they didn't even plan anything. There was just a threat. They were saying that we will do this unless you do A, B, and C. And UEFA, you could see, always compromised, always really accommodated these clubs. So there was that dance between the clubs, elite clubs, and UEFA, to the point that now European club competition is actually run by elite clubs. It's not run by UEFA. There is a club competition committee within UEFA structure that was slowly occupied by the ECA members. So European Club Association is actually, I think, 13 out of 17 members of the club competition committee that decides on competition formats and approves them, actually. And yeah, it's kind of, so who is running the show. They always have to, UEFA always has to take into account, firstly and foremost, the interest of the elite, and only then of everybody else. Elite is possibly about 20 clubs in Europe. And there are at least 1,000 more clubs that are professional clubs that are playing in professional leagues whose interests are not at all taken into account. So there is obvious need for the sort of an association of the clubs or the union of clubs that are non-elite. and that will in fact represent the smaller and medium-sized clubs, and that is something that might soon even happen.
Right. And how do you think this, as you mentioned, dance between the clubs and UEFA? How do you see it ending, or do you see it ending? Can the EU law not prohibit such attempts in the future? Like, for example, recently, the Premier League has come up with a fine of £22 million combined across the 6 Premier League clubs that signed up for ESL. That's like less than £4 million per club, or about 3 to 4 months' wages at tops for one of their best.
Yeah.
I know they've been threatened with bigger fines if they try to pull something similar in the future, like a 30-point deduction. But do you think it's a good enough deterrent for them to, stop something like this in the future again?
Your question was, how can EU law prohibit this dance where clubs are threatening and UEFA is just accommodating them? Yes, I believe that what is happening with that dance is anti-competitive from UEFA point of view, because they are doing it to maintain organizational monopoly and maintain the control over not just regulatory aspects of football, which they can, and properly. Nobody can really challenge regulatory monopoly of UEFA, but commercial monopoly has to, that's not the aspect that they can grab onto. And in order to keep that commercial monopoly, be the only organizer, they are willing then to compromise with these clubs that are clearly, in my opinion, constituting something that competition lawyers will know as collectively dominant undertakings. So they are not a dominant company on the market each individually, but they are in fact presenting themselves as the uniform or the united front. They fit all the criteria, most of the criteria at least, for collectively dominant undertaking, and that is all that you need. So as a collectively dominant undertaking, they can abuse that dominant position to the detriment of other participants of the market, which is what they are doing. Every time UEFA is forced and blackmailed, that is a breach of the abuse of dominant position. And every time they do that, it is a detriment to the smaller and medium-sized clubs, because they are losing. So the moment the elite clubs are gaining something, smaller and medium-sized clubs are losing something, because elite clubs wouldn't want it if they, there's only, I think Roshan has partly really addressed that problem, that market might be really saturated. Fans cannot pay anymore to watch even a single league. It is absolutely insane. And you need possibly, just to watch one Premier League game with perhaps, if one family, one of 4 wants to go, mother, father, and 2 kids, how much do you need to, pay? It's possibly, maybe 200, 300 pounds. And if you want a subscription to one league, you have to pay all these subscriptions to all of these, because every single broadcaster will obviously bid for the rights, and some will get parts of those rights, the others will get the other. So there is no single broadcaster where you can just pay and watch all the league. So it's become ridiculously expensive, and there is nothing that market perhaps can give anymore. And that is why Infantino's dream of perhaps creating the World Cup is not necessarily, linked to just the taking away authority and taking away the best clubs from Europe from the regulatory purview of UEFA, but it's also that this can be then marketed to new markets. And there is a whole new market in Asia, obviously. An American market is very much, up and coming as well. And, the Latin American market always existed, obviously. And so you can actually find new market there, even, so that is one way perhaps of extracting more, because European market, I don't think they can get any more than they are. It's simply saturated. What did you say, Roshan?
That's it. Yeah, it's completely saturated and they can't get any more out of it.
Yeah. So they are looking for new markets, new ways to get more money out of football, and then, this entire system makes one thing, wait a minute, where's the limit? How much more can you pay to the footballers? Because the biggest expenses that one club can have in Europe is the salaries of footballers, by far the biggest expense. The biggest income generator for these elite clubs, at least, is broadcasting money. And then sponsorship and ticketing. For smaller clubs, it's ticketing usually, because they don't have that broadcasting value. They don't have that big of a sponsorship value. And so they are trying to basically create new markets with this. EU law can interfere, there is one problem with EU law interfering into this. It is that European Commission that is supposed to make sure that markets are competitive, that there is an equality of opportunity between economic operators. In our case, it's between the different clubs. European Commission is very much prone to being lobbied with, and sports lobby is one of the most powerful in Brussels, in European Union headquarters. So there is the aspect of politicization of enforcement of competition law that is playing a big part, and there is that, and then there is politicization of the entire football industry, because smaller and medium-sized clubs that could bring this case are absolutely terrified of the consequences of boycotts and other things. They will be, if they were ever to bring such a case to challenge this, what we call the dance between UEFA and elite clubs, they would be probably very much put under pressure by their own national associations, first of all, by bigger clubs in their leagues, by UEFA itself. So everybody would perhaps on that political level make sure that this doesn't happen.
Right. But I'm curious because such breakaway leagues have been allowed in other sports in Europe, like skating and basketball in recent memory. So in 2017, the European Commission regulators sided with a pair of Dutch speed skaters when they sought to compete in highly paid events that weren't sanctioned by the world governing body, which is the International Skating Union. And similarly, EuroLeague Basketball is an organization that was formed through a similar breakaway in 2000. It brought together successful teams in Europe. And it didn't have the backing of the World Basketball Governing Body, which is FIBA. So how are these leagues allowed under European law?
Okay, so as I say often to my students, and they always pose a similar question, like, well, if that is the law, how come this is happening? Well, because nobody's challenged it. Let me start from EuroLeague basketball case. In 2016, somebody did challenge it. And there is, since 2016, and this goes back to my point about politicization of the enforcement, there is a case that was brought by EuroLeague Basketball against FIBA and FIBA Europe. And there was a case brought by FIBA Europe against EuroLeague Basketball, because neither are, in fact, doing things completely legally. FIBA and FIBA Europe were putting pressure on the national associations to ban players and clubs that are participating in this league. So there was, back then, they were actually putting pressure on those national associations. And that complaint involves that. But breakaway leagues can break law themselves. And the way that EuroLeague basketball is run, for instance, that is one thing that has been challenged, that 6 powerful clubs are in fact cherry picking and deciding on behalf of everybody. And that is just the governance structure that is really not, it's not competitive. It doesn't really allow for others to participate in the governance. And that is where the problems on the market start, really. And the secondly, so that there is a case, but European Commission isn't picking it up. And in 2017, European Parliament interfered and asked the Commission, do something about this. Open up the investigation. Don't have this case sit on your table for so long. And it's still nothing's happening, absolutely nothing. So there is a cross complaint, and that case could really, if European Commission would pick it up, because it brings a lot of similar issues to football, to UEFA and Super League clubs, a lot of similar issues legally. So if they decided the basketball case finally, or decided to open up investigation, we would have in football some answers legally. Second case you brought up is the ISU, International Skating Union, and that one has been, yes, decided by the Commission, but then it was appealed and the court confirmed the Commission decision. And now it's still under second appeal to the highest, or to the highest judicial body in Europe. The ISU was different, and there was some guidelines also set, because you see, when governing bodies are engaging in the organizational market, let's say, they are really trying to prevent or trying to maintain their monopoly on that organizational market. And one of the ways that they are doing it is by saying you need prior license to the clubs. And then the license really not issued ever, you know. And the second way they are doing it is by placing restrictions on everything that super leagues or any alternative leagues would need to actually create a product, which is players, officials. And in ISU case, skaters were told by the governing body that if you participate in the alternative competition, you can be banned for life. If we haven't approved that alternative competition, you cannot participate in it because it's unauthorized, and you can get banned by life. And that was quite a severe threat and quite disproportionate sanction. So we know now, and this is interesting in the context of Super League, from that ISU case, we know that restrictions and bans that are lifelong are grossly disproportionate. That's what court says, a draconian restriction. The court, however, also left a possibility of sanctions existing of some kind and bans existing, but they didn't tell us how long would, you know, be proportioned, because every case will be turning on its own merits and on its own facts to decide what proportionate bans are. So now that UEFA has these three clubs, Madrid and Barcelona and Juventus, still connected to the Super League and still not giving up the project, it started disciplinary proceedings against them. But the clubs have filed also a case in April when they started Super League talk. They filed in April a case in Madrid court asking for injunction and to prevent UEFA from implementing the threats from banning them from domestic leagues. So now the Madrid court has issued such injunction, but it is just a temporary measure until the case is being decided. And at the same time, UEFA then started disciplinary proceedings, you see, and it had to, now that the case has been sent to the European Court of Justice for decision from Madrid court, UEFA had to stay its proceedings. So now the disciplinary proceedings against clubs are actually stayed, awaiting for the results from the court. And it will be what the court says, basically. The court says, as I expect, regulatory monopoly and the power to issue licenses is okay, it's legal. How do you use this power is another thing. You cannot use it abusively, because as a monopolist, you are a dominant company and you cannot abuse it. So that's why I mentioned conditions for the issuing of license have to be transparent, clear, non-discriminatory, objective, and so on. And UEFA did not have anywhere listed these conditions. You couldn't find them. So they didn't have transparent systems. So that is UEFA's fault here. But that didn't give a club, or any club, right to just take off and leave, or to use that regulatory gap and the lack of detail to just leave. What they should have done, as I mentioned, is just go over to the UEFA and ask, well, under Article 49 of your statutes that provides that I need license to start alternative competition, what exactly do I need to do? What conditions I need to fulfill? What is it that you're asking of us? And that would be enough, really. because there are cases that provide for. So I expect the case to confirm the regulatory authority. Court will perhaps say that UEFA should have had transparent set of conditions. The threats that UEFA used to ban the clubs from domestic, they weren't really implemented because most of the clubs have withdrawn, whether due to those threats or not, but these 3 clubs haven't. And whether or not that was disproportionate reaction or not, it remains to be seen. So everything, in my opinion, will come down to a question of proportionality. I know that UEFA was mentioning 2 years of a ban for at least from its own competitions. I'm not sure what each national association would do in regard to their clubs and in regard to their domestic leagues, but all of it together will have to be really assessed. And I am looking forward really to reading this judgment if it comes. If something doesn't happen again in the meanwhile, that maybe, as I said, they were testing the waters. Who knows? Maybe it will be withdrawn, the entire case, and some compromise will be reached and something will be done to again allow these clubs to go back and just continue with the same old. We will really see, but it's the most interesting times. I mean, nothing like this has happened in the history of European football. Nothing has gone this far.
Right. Fascinating and complex topic. There's so much to discuss, but I think we're almost out of time. So before we move into the audience Q&A, I had one question for both of you, the same question, both of you can answer. That is, will we be talking about breakaway leagues again in, say, 10 years or maybe even before that? Katarina, do you want to go first?
Yes. Yes, we will be talking. This isn't the last we've heard about this idea. It's not the first, it's not the last. We might even see a breakaway league, but as I said, that breakaway league will have to be sanctioned by UEFA, and it cannot be one of those wild breakaway leagues. That is because it is the job of a governing body, at least theoretically, and they have this wide mandate over the sport to protect public interest objectives. If you're a governing body, you have to ensure safety at events. You have to ensure protocols are observed. You have to ensure that anti-doping control is conducted properly. You are also in charge of the public image of sports. So things like match fixing and all of those issues have to be, all the control mechanisms have to be in place. The well-being of a smaller clubs and their financial viability and solidarity. There is a vast number of functions that one governing body performs. So they take care of the entire sport, and it is clearly not workable to leave these public interest objectives in the hands of private operators, as Roshan said, some sort of people from United States who don't know anything about European traditions, or so it is unworkable to leave public interest objectives in the hands of private commercially interested bodies. So that is one of the reasons why the regulatory monopoly must be in a single body, and we will see more breakaway leagues, but they are not going to be crazy like this one.
Roshan, do you think we'll see another World Series cricket?
Well, there was talk of something similar happening about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, of an alternative global structure for cricket being set up.
That was against Prakash Chandra, right? The same.
Yeah. There's again Z. And the fact is, with sports governing bodies, right, we will continue to see a conflict of interest. So the way of looking at it is that while, as Katrina said, they're also the regulators of the sport, they're also the promoters of their own interests, commercial interests in the sport. So a typical constitution for a sports governing body will say that, we have the right to approve leagues. But then when it comes to setting up their own league and giving representations to, say, a sponsor or to a broadcaster, the kind of representation that's provided is that we will not recognize any competing league for the next 10 years. It's something that we've seen with competition law cases in India. The BCCI actually has been found guilty of engaging in abuse of dominant position by providing such representations in its media rights deals for the Indian Premier League. And the fact is that they also tend to come down really hard on anyone who tries to provide an alternative. So you've seen it with the ICL, where the BCCI, in addition to not recognizing the league itself, also imposed player bans. They ensured that the ICL didn't have access to any proper cricketing facilities because they were all run by bodies affiliated to the BCCI. The benefits to players like pensions, for instance, which were a right for the players, right? They were all withdrawn. And even entities associated with the ICL were blacklisted. So clearly a case of overreach there. And we've seen the Chess Federation in India, for instance, impose life bans on any players who wanted to associate with a rival body which was set up, and without giving the players the right to a fair hearing. So the fact is that I think as long as sports administration is run the way it is, we're not going to see the last of any rebel leagues. And to be honest, it's a little ironic that the ESL had 6 Premier League clubs participating in it, because the Premier League itself is a rebel league. So after 104 years, the 19 clubs, I think, in the first division, the old first division, just broke away from the Football League after 104 years of being associated with it. And their reasoning at that point was very similar to what the ESL clubs are telling us now. They said, we want all this money, right? We want whatever we are generating. We don't want to share that with the lower leagues. I think I read a quote saying that they wanted to prevent loss of revenue to the lower leagues, which tells you a lot about the mindset. And the fact is that most of these clubs, at least in Europe, exist outside of the system, in the sense that they were set up first and joined the league later, as opposed to the franchise-style team which is set up purely to participate in a league. So they'll still continue to retain, I think, their independent identity. But with the change in ownership, as we've seen, especially with the Italian clubs, the government of China apparently now owns part of Inter Milan. Right? And we're going to see a lot more sport washing in play as well. So one of the reasons they said put forward for why PSG didn't join the ESL was the fact that the next World Cup is in Qatar. So they didn't want to spoil that relationship with Uefa and FIFA. And beIN Sports is a rights holder for football broadcast rights in the Middle East and North Africa. So they didn't want those relationships to be spoiled. So maybe after 2022, we'll see a different side to PSG.
Vipul asks if is ATK Mohan Bagan a good example for how the Indian football clubs should move forward? Roshan?
Well, yes and no. It's worked with ATK, it's not worked with East Bengal. I think is the simple cross-city answer. It also depends, I guess, on just to what extent the legacy clubs kind of understand their current relevance in the market. Because they've had a huge chance these are clubs with 100 years of heritage. But which the moment a new league came along, they weren't even considered for participation. So they definitely need to change the way they function. And all that is of value with these clubs is essentially their sporting rights. That's what an ATK want. That's what Sri Cement want right now. And there's news that East Bengal may not even be part of the ISL from next season, because they haven't signed the term sheet yet with the investors. Because one thing is, investors come in, right? It's the same model. This is no longer the club that your parents or your grandparents supported. It's a pure business. They want the legacy, but they also want to run it the way they would run a normal business, for instance.
Saurabh asks, is the UEFA Conference League something that's here to stay, or just a carrot being dangled before clubs who can't enter Europe's elite competitions to prevent any breakaway league ideas? Katarina?
Is it here to stay? It's really impossible really to say at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen even with the entire structure of European football. And we do know, however, that the Conference League was really created to push the smaller and medium-sized out of the Champions League and out of the Europa League into another competition. So if you actually were watching the European leagues organized, the club advisory forum, one of those first ones that was organized in 2000, I think 18 or 19 in Madrid, then you will have seen what kind of statistics and how does it really influence small clubs. In other words, the entire 3-tier was organized to perhaps please the small clubs somehow, and or at least to make it seem like they now have more opportunities, when in fact they were creating elite competitions, something akin to Super League. So that's why I was kind of quite surprised that, given how good format for elite clubs in the 2024 Champions League is, why did they want more than that? Why did they want them to stir up the conflicts and engage in all of this fiasco? But as I said, now we are wiser. The FIFA's involvement, actually Infantino's involvement, and we know why. And it's all really commercial.
Rajiv,
I don't know. In other words, I have no idea if it's here to stay. Just to answer the question,
Rajiv asks, is there any place for a transnational league for clubs from smaller European nations such as Estonia, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Latvia, Romania, Slovakia, etc., with a view to promote football beyond the big European football nations, which are England, France, Spain, Italy, Germany? Katarina, I think you've written in your book about there were such attempts in the past with the Atlantic League, which was signed on by the Rangers and Celtic and some Dutch clubs, and I think even Belgium and Portugal. And there was one league with all the Scandinavian countries as well. But I think they did not really, pan out for more than like a few seasons.
Yes. There was Atlantic League planned as well. There was, if you've looked at the book, then you will have seen there was a number of attempts. And but is there a scope legally? Yes, anybody. It can be, or the league can be consisting of any clubs originally. I think in European structures and under European competition law, it has to be open. And that is the criteria, one of the main criteria. It has to contribute solidarity to the overall UEFA funds that are then going to be redistributed back to national associations, and through them to smaller and medium-sized clubs that are not really participating in these competitions. We can expect, there is a lot on that front going on. There are people actually working on this for years already, and sometimes the domestic leagues are becoming unsustainable, and maybe they will have to, go ahead and create something that is more pan-European than just, a domestic competition for some of their teams, and hope that they will be successful, hope that they will be able to, so to speak, donate or, engage in that solidarity, and send back to their national leagues that they have left and basically depleted or devalue them in terms of broadcasting rights, that they will be able to cover for that. And that is the idea, that yes, we are leaving, yes, we are devaluing domestic leagues, but here's the money. And in that sense, we would be seeing more and more of domestic leagues in many European countries becoming like feeder leagues, and just to develop players to play in these bigger leagues. In terms of sustainability, financial sustainability, and how viable commercially these leagues, well, they would have to do some investments and some good financial planning. They would have to have an investor behind them that is willing to at least, give it a try. And basically, the media investors might be even, initially the best, that they would buy the rights and they would be the investors. So perhaps up to 5 years, something like that could be initially set up. But yeah, it's quite possible to organize any league legally. Viability in financial terms is something that is beyond my competence, basically.
Vipul asks, since the current financial fair play has proven to not serve its purpose, what is stopping UEFA and national federations from adopting the financial and wage regulations similar to those in American leagues?
So I think that the way to look at it is that anything which is imposed by UEFA or FIFA is going to be challenged. I think Sheikh Mansour showed us just how well that could be done. Because even with the ESL, news reports do suggest that the members had agreed on a salary cap in terms of what could be spent on players every season, because they also realized that while they're potentially making 250 million pounds a year, the fact is that 250 million, if you want to sign the best players in the world, just goes away in a minute, right? It's not a huge sum. You look at the amount of investment to be made. I think an interesting case study probably is from Formula One. If you look at just how the teams have come together and said, yes, like I think Toto Wolff put out a statement saying we recognize that, the Mercedes team brings in a lot of revenue to Formula One. But the fact is Formula One doesn't exist without the other teams participating in it. So if it means we earn less, but the league is more sustainable and we have a salary cap, that's something we would be open to. That's something you need, because you want all the teams to start competing on even footing. That is essentially the base principle of sport, that you have equal competition and try and ensure that you have fair competition.
No, I think that he's covered pretty much everything. And I'm just looking through these questions. The one about the financial fair play and what is stopping UEFA and national federations from adopting the financial and wage regulator. So they are probably referring to salary cap here, right?
Yeah.
Well, the way that I'm thinking about it is that it's easy to implement salary cap in a franchise system like in the United States. It's just you implement it, you impose it, and that's it. It applies to all the clubs, and that's it. But in an open system with promotion and relegations, where clubs move from one league to another, that is going to be massively difficult to implement. In fact, yesterday we had an entire seminar on that. It was a Morgan law seminar, and there are several reasons why it wouldn't really work. There is as I said, promotion and relegation system presents challenge to successful implementation of salary cap. There are tax systems in Europe that are different from country to country. So if you're playing, say, in Monaco, that club will pay 0 taxes on everything, and you'll pay on your wages 0%. So you will get whatever the cap is, you'll get the entire thing, if you're paid at the top maximum. But in Sweden, that would go like 50-60% of tax on so the players would kind of naturally be migrating to the countries and leagues with the domestic, where taxes are lower. So then we would get another problem. And there are other things then that the high income country, well, the same thing, basically high income countries would have a trouble attracting players in that sense. So it would be seen as some completely different ball game than implementing if you start thinking about it, it's going to be quite difficult. And whatever UEFA would take, whatever decision, it would only just apply to their championships, in Europe, there is one thing, and under competition law, that is that the collective bargaining agreements that come out of the social dialogue process between employers and employees are exempt from competition law. So salary caps might not even be, at all. In general, they might not even be legal, depending on what kind of salary cap. Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it too high? Is it too low? There are many permutations how it can comply with. It can comply, but will it? And there is that. But if you want it for sure to comply, it has to come out of collective bargaining. So if players sit, or the fifth pro in Europe, if they sit, and then they represent players, if they sit with the European Club Association to negotiate the salary cap, and that agreement is reached, it is exempt from competition law. But in Europe, we don't have collective bargaining culture.
Nandi Ghosh asks, this entire ESL as well as the new Champions League format, which will come into force from 2024, promotes playing 9 to 10 group games, thus generating more revenue. It'll be physically impossible for players to play so many games without endangering their health and safety. In such a case, it's highly possible that domestic cup competitions will lose their significance as these big clubs may start fielding weekend sides in the cup competitions. How do you think the FA and similar organizations should handle this situation, considering the fact that these cup competitions have a huge significance for clubs in lower divisions?
Not sure about the FA, but any other national association. This is something obviously that they can address. And since you've mentioned also the health and safety issue, it is a matter for FIFPro as well, to address as such. But this is something that is a really good comment, because something like this could further then weaken whatever domestic league is left. Obviously, FA and other national association could start taking some measures. But is there such rule in football, or isn't there, that you are required to use your best squad for the games, or something like that? Or is this something that I've maybe read in some national association somewhere, and I thought maybe that it applies generally? Is there anything like that you're supposed to be putting your best foot forward?
I think there is. I think a couple of Premier League teams have also been fined. Yeah. But eventually, clubs are also willing to accept the fines rather than risk further injuries to players, or to focus on the more important matches.
Yeah, very good. Very good comment. Very good question. We don't really know. We don't really know what's going to happen and how that will work itself out. But now that 2024 is 3 years from now, I guess we'll see soon enough.
Tushar asks, would the European Super League have created a cartel in the football ecosystem because of no relegations? And can such leagues hamper the future of other smaller clubs? Now, this is interesting because when the ESL was announced, the clubs did say that they would put, I think, 10 billion euros towards the grassroots and in the football pyramid. How does that play? Like, I think the main criticism was that this would destroy the football pyramid. So how does those two things balance out?
Can you then summarize the very last bit of it, because you said one thing and then the other, and how do they?
So I think he's asking, can such leagues hamper the future of smaller clubs? Now,
yes.
The criticism of the ESL was that, it would destroy the football pyramid and money would not go down the pyramid. But the ESL clubs did announce, that they would put 10 billion euros, I think it was, over 23 years into the pyramid. So what exactly is the case? Like?
Yes, they did have a certain solidarity contribution, just like 98 proposal also had quite a nice sum that was intended. But we have to wonder what the clubs would be doing with this money if they cannot really play in the highest leagues, and they will always be confined to the lower and less valuable commercially leagues. Also, the money that they would get would go only that far. And then what? When that period expires, what then? What's going to happen? Then we are going to have the entirely Americanized system. And that is something that, if you read Helsinki report on sport from 1999, I guess, you will see how Europe actually sees, and European policymakers, that kind of structure with the closed leagues, and just like an Americanized system that Europe should avoid. I'm really not sure, but yeah, there is a solidarity payment that would be in fact asked even by Uefa under one of its conditions, and it would be legal to ask. You have to contribute parts of your revenues or profits, and it's this much, and it cannot be any different than Champions League is contributing. In other words, its own competition.
Right. Shubham asks, the proposed Bene Liga may show one way of how things are likely to be in the future, merging of domestic leagues.
Bene Liga in football was the only league ever approved by Uefa. So if you're looking for one approval, that was Bene League, but it was in women's football. And it lasted for a couple of years, and it was then disbanded because of the commercially it wasn't quite viable as they intended, and that was it. So it was a while ago. And now there is a proposal for a men's, maybe merging of domestic leagues. But when you're talking of merging of domestic leagues, that's quite a bit of a different, maybe story. In either case, it is a cross-border competition. It's within UEFA's authority to approve it or not. And I think they might do it a bit smarter than the Super League did it, because it can't get any worse.
And finally, we have Sai Krishna, who asks, leaving IPL aside, can franchise-based, business-oriented club model in football be sustainable within the Indian context, particularly when we battle with lack of culture in respective sport, governance, and economic issues?
Well, the honest answer there is, I think it's linked to the appetite for risk that all the team owners have. As of last year, I think we had the JSW group and Pat Jindal putting out a statement saying, how sustainable is the league if we're losing 25 to 30 crore a year? And it's essentially going to come down to that, because the performance of our national team also is going to be one of the drivers for any increase in, I guess, just the commercial value of Indian football. But even the league as such, it's more or less a privately held venture. It's Reliance and Star. I think they're also losing money in trying to organize the league, especially in a centralized format like they did last year. So at some point, I think there has to be a market valuation of what the league is actually worth. I think all the teams are now trying to push for a serious use of the salary cap, but there seem to be certain gaps in the system now, which are being exploited by certain teams. But the fact is, it's essentially how long are you willing to lose money? And at least with the IPL, I think you knew what the broadcast values were right from year one. And they actually doubled from year one to year two. So you knew that you had a successful product on your hands. But that's not necessarily the case in any of the other franchise leagues in India right now. And as with, I guess, any good business or with any bad business, the moment the losses mount, you just shut it down.
I think we have one final question. With the likes of Faf du Plessis feeling in about 10 years due to growth of franchise cricket, international cricket may reduce. Will it be restricted considering the market for franchise cricket? Roshan, quick one.
This has been a question on everyone's mind, I think, for a few years now, especially with the mushrooming of the T20 leagues. It's a question really for all the boards and the ICC to sit down and figure out what they're going to do with the number of leagues, and because there's clearly going to be player fatigue, especially now when players are going from bio bubble to bio bubble. But eventually, Test cricket is Test cricket. I think there's a certain amount of prestige associated with representing your country at what is the toughest format of cricket, and you can find a window. But again, it comes down to the role of being a regulator of sport versus a promoter of a sport, and what is it that each governing body chooses to do.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Katarina and Roshan.